All right, good morning, everybody, and welcome to part 5 of our Eschatology series, study on the end times. Eschatos meaning end, logos meaning study. We said that plenty of times, I guess. So here's what we've covered so far, the common factors and the different views. We laid the foundation of what was going to go on, and then week 3, we really started to dive in to God's plan for the end of time and humanity. We covered Daniel's 70 weeks, which remember Daniel discovers this prophecy while he's stuck in Babylon. He reads Jeremiah's scroll, realizes they're going to get out soon and the time's almost up. And as he's praying, he gets a prophecy, which gives us the end times, the 70 weeks, which we went over that. And then last week, we went with the next event. The next event we're waiting for is the rapture of the church. That's us. That's what we look forward to and we're excited about. And then we also learned about how it just doesn't end at the rapture, how there's a Bema Seat judgment, and we will be rewarded based on our deeds for the Lord and what we did for him. And now we're going to move into another controversial one. This is a fun one, though. The Gog and Magog Wars. Some of you might be very familiar with, some a little familiar with, some never heard of any of this. And this will be an interesting one before we get into the tribulation and the second coming and all of those things in the last 2 weeks. So remember, again, there's Daniel 70 weeks. It's a really great chart to understand what's been going on. Remember the decree in Nehemiah in 445 BC happened. Jesus showed up. Israel missed it when he rode into the donkey. That's why Jesus weeps, right? They missed it. And now, since then, Israel's been spiritually blinded for the sake of the Gentiles. That's any of us who are not Jews. So we could come into the church. And that's where we are at with the church age, right? That's where we're living right now. I like to think we're at the end of the church age, but who knows? Only the Lord knows. But there's a lot of signs I've been talking about that show that we are very close to the point of the rapture. Now, you can see in this picture, the next thing on here is the tribulation. A lot of charts don't have Gog and Magog because there's a slight controversy of where it lands, but I believe it lands right after the rapture, and I'll tell you why. So we're still kind of right before that tribulation. When that arrow goes up, there will be a little gap between that arrow of the rapture and when the tribulation kicks off, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. And these are called, of course, the Gog and Magog Wars. Now, I'm calling them wars because there's actually multiple events, and we're going to jump into that. And it can be confusing if you don't pay attention to the details. Some people will blend these. But there's a difference. There's 2 Gog and Magog Wars. That's why I call them the Gog and Magog Wars. Ezekiel 38 and 39, that's the one we're going to be focused on today because that is the one that is up next. So we're going to be in Ezekiel 38 and 39 a lot. However, there's also a Gog and Magog you'll read about in Revelation 20. It has some similarities, but it's very different when you start breaking down the details. So I want to make it known right now that these are 2 separate events. One is coming up very soon. One won't happen for at least 1,007 years or longer, based on our math, but it could be obviously longer. And Ezekiel 38 and 39, the one we're going to cover today, I believe occurs after the rapture, but before the millennial kingdom, right? And I do believe it happens before the tribulation as well. Some people get the idea that once the rapture happens, immediately later, the Antichrist signs the deal, and that's not the case. I mean, it could happen that way, but there is going to probably be a gap of time from when we are raptured to when the tribulation starts. It doesn't say, the Bible doesn't say that it has to start immediately after. It's probably going to be close. It'll probably be, I don't know how long, but there will have to be a gap of time after we're gone. The chaos will settle. There'll be a lot of things going on until the Antichrist can come out and sign the deal. And we're going to talk more about that. But Ezekiel 38 and 39, it involves specific nations we're going to look at, and it ends with the defeat of the coalition and Israel's spiritual awakening. That's a difference between Revelation 21, which occurs after the millennial kingdom, involves a global rebellion, all nations, not just some, led by Satan, and it ends with Satan's final defeat and the great white throne judgment. You don't see that in Ezekiel 38 and 39 episodes there. So these are 2 different wars. That's why I'm calling this the Gog and Magog Wars, because they are 2 separate events, and we got to keep them separate. But we're going to focus on Ezekiel 38 and 39 because that's really the one that is very close according to the timeline. So first off, the timing is debated. This is why a lot of charts won't even have it. It's not as hotly debated as, pre-trib, post-trib kind of stuff. But some people wonder, will this happen before the rapture? There's maybe a possibility that this could happen before we're gone. Or will it happen after the rapture? I believe it happens after the rapture. Why do I say that? Well, the rapture is imminent. We know the rapture could happen, and the Bible's always talking about things could happen at any time. The rapture, we could be gone. The Lord can return at any moment. We don't really have that from the Gog and Magog prophecy. Now, it could still happen, before the rapture maybe, but I don't think so because it mainly deals with a spiritual awakening. Ezekiel 38 and 39, Gog and Magog, is all about awakening Israel again, spiritual awakening. Remember, during the church age, he's only dealing with the church right now. That's where we're trying to get, people are getting saved. After the rapture, he turns his focus to Israel. So right there, I would say it wouldn't happen before the rapture because the Lord won't focus on Israel again until after he's done focusing on the church. So that's why I think it's after the rapture. Then there's these times things coming. Some people will say, well, what if it happens in the middle of the tribulation, or is this Armageddon? Is Gog and Magog at the end when you defeat the Antichrist? No. Armageddon is completely separate from this. And there's a whole when we get into the 7 years in this, there's 7 years in this prophecy that'll help us line up with the tribulation. That'll make a little bit more sense. But I do believe Gog and Magog, since it deals with Israel again, will happen after the rapture, and maybe pretty quickly after the rapture, maybe a couple weeks, couple months, a couple days, I don't know, but it will be shortly after the rapture, I believe. And it will, like I said, align with the tribulation. When we'll talk about 7 years in Ezekiel 39, you'll see it relate to that. And remember, Romans 11, 25 through 27 is the scripture that talks about the partial hardening of Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles. So again, that confirms, why would the Lord start softening the hearts if the fullness of the Gentiles had not come through for the rapture? So the rapture, I think, has to happen before the Gog and Magog war, which is why we studied the rapture last week and Gog and Magog this week, because I'm trying to do things in chronological order for you guys, the best as I can see it. But God will shift his focus to save all of Israel, and this is the beginning of that process. It's not the tribulation. This actually starts at the tribulation. Will continue it until it's fulfilled halfway through. But this gets the party started, you could say. So first off, again, just like in Daniel, to understand Daniel's 70 weeks, we had to understand the context. We also have to understand the context of Ezekiel's prophecy. What was going on with Ezekiel? Because if you can read Daniel's 70 weeks, and if you missed that whole Jeremiah thing, which a lot of people do, it's not as powerful as when you realize what was going on and all these prophecies and everything was going on. Well, Ezekiel, the way the book is laid out, is very important for understanding this. And it will help, again, I think, clarify why this would happen after the rapture and why it's a focus on literal national Israel. So there's a section called the restoration section of Ezekiel, they'll call it. There's it's a 48 chapter book. And once you get to chapter 33, all the way through 48, it's nothing but restoration, okay? So in Ezekiel 36 and 37, those are the two chapters before the Gog and Magog war. And that talks about the physical restoration of Israel. Then you have Ezekiel 38, 39, runs right into the Gog and Magog war. And do you know what happens right after the Gog and Magog war prophecy? It goes into Ezekiel 40, which for the rest of the book talks about the millennial temple. The temple that will be when the Lord comes back on earth, how the temple will be laid out. So you can see the order of events just right here. He's going to restore Israel physically, then he's going to restore them spiritually, starting with the Gog and Magog war, run them through the tribulation, and once everything comes out, he talks about the millennial temple and how that will be when the Lord returns. So right here, when you put it in context, you can see the flow of events here. That's when the restoration prophecies begin, and it happens, and this one happens right after the restoration of Israel prophecies. And I'm just going to breeze through a little bit of Ezekiel 36 and 37, just to give you a background if you aren't familiar with the restoration of Israel and these prophecies here. So this, of course, like I said, sets the stage for the Gog and Magog invasion. This whole chapter. These chapters describe Israel's physical and spiritual restoration. And like I said, it's crucial for understanding the prophetic timeline, because if you didn't understand that this is dealing with Israel, you could put it anywhere you want. But again, when we're focusing on Israel, and we see so much about Jerusalem and Israel being restored, and then this language, we know that this is setting up for that. But remember, it goes a physical restoration first, then a spiritual restoration. And Ezekiel 36 was God's promise to restore Israel. Ezekiel 37, you guys are probably really familiar with the Valley of the Dry Bones prophecy. Remember that part? That's right before the Gog and Magog prophecy. Ezekiel 36, verses 22 and 23 talks about how God acted for the sake of his name, not because of Israel's righteousness. And that would make sense, right? Because Israel right now rejects Christ. There's like 1.7% of Christians in Israel. They're spiritually blind, as it said, right? But in Ezekiel 36, God says, "It is not for your sake, O house of Israel, that I am about to act, but for the sake of my holy name," which is showing that Israel's restoration is going to highlight God's holiness and sovereignty to the nations. He's going to do this to make his name great again among the nations and Israel. Everybody that's going to see this event will know he's God. Verses 24 through 28 of chapter 36, he promises to regather Israel, to cleanse them, and to give them a new heart. You guys know that verse about they get a new heart from stone to flesh. That happens again right before the Gog and Magog wars. Israel's physical return to the land precedes their spiritual renewal, and that's why we are still awaiting Israel's spiritual awakening in Christ. They have been restored physically, right? They've been restored physically, but spiritually they're still lost. So we're only partway through their restoration process, which began in 1948. That's pretty recent. Here's a prophecy, and I think it could be a prophecy of the modern return. Isaiah 11:11 says, "In that day the Lord will extend his hand yet a second time to recover the remnant that remains of his people." Look where? Not from Babylon. It's not talking about Babylon. From Assyria, from Egypt, from Pathros, from Cush, from Elam, from Shinar, from Hamath, and from the coastlands of the sea. Talking about the second time the Lord's going to regather the people. And I believe that refers to this 1948 regathering that we saw. This is a reference to a time after Babylon. Like I said, this is not, otherwise it would say, "I'll return you from a second time from Babylon." But it's starting to say all these other nations that are not Babylon. It's talking about recovering all the tribes, because remember, the north had 10 tribes, and they're lost. They didn't go to Babylon. They're still, quote unquote, gone to this day. But they're coming back. So this is talking about this prophecy of the modern return right here in the Scripture. It also said that the land that would be desolate would be turned into like the Garden of Eden. And they will say, "This land that was desolate has become like the Garden of Eden, and the waste and desolate and ruined cities are now fortified and inhabited," which is really interesting. So it's saying the land will be desolate like a desert, right? That's why there's deserts over the Middle East, because that was God's way to show death. Where the deserts are, there is no life, right? It used to be flourishing, and God says, "I'll make it flourish again," right? Amos 9:14 and 15 talks about how permanent this will be. Look what Amos says in chapter 9. "I will restore the fortunes of my people Israel, and they shall rebuild the ruined cities and inhabit them. They shall plant vineyards and drink their wine, and they shall make gardens and eat their fruit. I will plant them on their land, and they shall never again be uprooted to the land that I have given them, says the Lord your God." What's interesting, Mark Twain, who was around in the 1800s, before Israel ever came back, it used to be called Palestine, right? Although Israel was there first, but that's what the land's called, Palestine. In 1867, you can read a quote by Mark Twain. Mark Twain went over there, and this is what he said. "Of all the lands that are for dismal scenery," really bad scenery, "I think Palestine," which would have been Israel, "must be the prince." Basically, Mark Twain went over there and thought it was ugly land. There was nothing to see there. He didn't know why people wanted it. It was just nothing but desolate land and nothing growing. But if you look at pictures of Israel now, and you even just look at the history, since the 1948, it has boomed. There's a flourishing, almost like the Garden of Eden. And now they have exports they send out of the nation that they didn't do before they came back. So this is prophecy fulfilled from Amos, and we even have recent quotes from Mark Twain in 1867 to back this up. And that's not the only one. You can keep looking at how Israel has been restored physically. The world will tell you that, which is pretty amazing. And then the vision of dry bones, the valley of dry bones, is a pretty popular one. The bones come together, flesh appears. Remember it says in Ezekiel 37, "I looked and there were sinews on them, and flesh had come upon them, and skin had covered them, but there was no breath in them." See that? There was no breath in them. So there's a physical body, but there's no spirit. There's no spirit, right? And that's where we're at with Israel today. We're partway through the valley of dry bones, right? Because then after that, what does it say? There's a spiritual restoration, verses 9 and 10. "Come from the four winds, O breath, and breathe on these slain that they may live." Breath symbolizing the spirit. Remember, Abram was Abram until he got breath as Abraham, which sounds like a breath in the middle of Abram. Sounds like you're taking a breath. That's because that symbolizes the spirit of the Lord. This represents Israel's future spiritual awakening, which Gog and Magog will lead to. But notice that it talks about a breath, and Israel still does not have its breath because it's not a Christian nation. They still reject Christ. So we're in between even this. We're waiting for the spiritual restoration part of the valley of the dry bones to be fulfilled. And then, of course, at the end, you can tell it's a promise for the Lord and not just some other king, because it says, "Behold, I'll take the people of Israel from the nations among which they have gone. It'll gather them from all around." And it says, "And one king shall be king over them all. And they shall no longer be two nations," Israel and Judah, "and no longer divided into two kingdoms." And this is talking about there will be a permanent king, which will be Jesus, who will come, and they'll never be split up again. He'll rule forever and ever. God regathers them, and this is ultimately fulfilled in the millennial reign of Christ. So that's the background. You can see how Ezekiel's talking of all these prophecies about how Israel's going to be brought back, and Israel's going to be restored, and one day they'll get their breath in them, and then the Lord will reign forever. And then it pivots into this prophecy of Gog and Magog that we're going to get to in Ezekiel 38. So Ezekiel 38 and 39 that we're going to go over describes an invasion of Israel led by a leader named Gog and a coalition of nations. This event, of course, occurs after physical restoration of Israel, but before their spiritual renewal, which we're at right now. And this begins the spiritual awakening process. Like I said, the tribulation, remember the first half, they'll still be kind of confused. They'll want to worship God. They're going to be in their temple. They're going to be excited to worship the Lord because of this event that happens. But they're still going to be lost in the chaos, and the Antichrist will confuse them until halfway through they'll be able to see that it's the Lord. And we'll talk more about that next time I'm up here as well. But let's start with the invasion of Israel. So let's just start with Ezekiel 38. Let's read the first 9 verses. Ezekiel chapter 38. You can open up your Bibles if you haven't had them there yet. And that's where we'll be focusing today. All right, I'll just go ahead and read the first 9 verses of this prophecy. The word of the Lord came to me. Son of man, set your face toward Gog, of the land of Magog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal, and prophesy against him, and say, Thus says the Lord God, Behold, I am against you, O Gog, chief prince of Meshech and Tubal. And I will turn you about and put hooks into your jaws, and I will bring you out, and all your army, horses and horsemen, all of them clothed in full armor, a great host, all of them with buckler and shield, wielding swords. Persia, Cush, and Put are with them, all of them with shield and helmet. Gomer and all his hordes, Beth Togarmah from the uttermost parts of the north with all his hordes. Many people are with you. Be ready and keep ready, you and all your hosts that are assembled about you, and be a guard for them. After many days you will be mustered. In the latter years you will go against the land that is restored from war, the land whose people were gathered from many peoples upon the mountains of Israel, which had been a continual waste. Its people were brought out from the peoples and now dwell securely, all of them. You will advance coming on like a storm. You will be like a cloud covering the land, you and all your hordes, and many peoples with you. So right there, we start the prophecy off. This Gog is a leader. It says the chief prince, right? Chief prince of Meshech and Tubal. Now, what's really interesting about this prophecy, again, just like, remember, Israel wasn't around until 1948. Before 1948, we would have got mocked out of the room by people, again, because the amillennial thing looked pretty good because Israel never came back. And they said, who could invade Israel? There is no Israel. There will never be another Israel. This can't happen. But it can, because now Israel's back. But it would have looked pretty dismal, and some of us might have even been fooled into maybe it's just a spiritual representation. Maybe it's not a real event. But when they start using specific names in the Bible, it's usually pretty specific, as we'll see, to things going on. And the whole prophecy, you can see, is an attack on national Israel. It's all about that. So this had to happen. Israel had to come back, just like Ezekiel said in the last chapter. So this could happen. That's why there's no coincidence why the Valley of Dry Bones goes right before the Gog and Magog War, because they had to come back to be attacked, right? And that's what this is talking about here. So May of 1948 made this possible, so we know this is definitely a real physical war that will take place. And notice what it said. I didn't put this in my notes here, but notice what he says up in, let's see what verse is that, verse 4. And I will turn you about and put hooks into your jaws. Isn't that an interesting line? He'll put hooks into your jaws, and God's talking to Gog and Magog and these nations that are going to attack. So what it's saying is the Lord is making them do this for his plan. He's going to force them. He's going to draw them into their trap, right? He's going to let them come into this for a reason, because it shows that God is in control. Like, I'm going to force you to do this. This is how I'm going to wipe you guys out. This is how my plan is going to unfold throughout all of this. Now, to understand this, we heard a lot of weird names. If you go back to Genesis 10, you don't have to flip here because I put them up here for you, but Genesis 10, verses 1 and 2. Remember the table of nations? When I taught about the Tower of Babel, right before Genesis 11, the Tower of Babel, you learned about how the nations were divided up after the Tower of Babel into 70 different nations, and it lists the table of nations. Look what it says in the first 2 verses. These are the generations of the sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Sons were born to them after the flood, which we all know. And look at the next line. The sons of Japheth. Look at these names. Gomer, Magog, Madai, Javan, Tubal, Meshech, and even Tiras, right? So you notice Gomer, Magog, Tubal, and Meshech are in this. They're put in this prophecy, and you guys are probably, like a lot of people like me when I first read it, like, what are these words? What are these names doing here? But when you go back to Genesis, you see them. They're one of the first ones listed as the nations. So we are talking about literal nations of the past. But why do we use these weird names like Meshech, Tubal? Why can't it just say like regular names? Well, cities change names over time. Think about this. Did you guys know if you guys went back to the 1700s and you were looking for New York City, you'd never find it because it was called New Amsterdam? And New Amsterdam became New York City. Did you know that Istanbul, a lot of you guys, if you're Christian, you know this, Istanbul in Turkey used to be Constantinople. Constantine moved the capital there, right? Mumbai in India just recently was Bombay. St. Petersburg has the most ridiculous history of all. St. Petersburg turned into Petrograd, then it turned into Stalingrad, and now it's St. Petersburg again, right? And then, of course, Sunbury. If you read old books, which I do, about local history, you'll never see Sunbury listed. It'll talk about Shamokin, because Shamokin was actually the whole stretch, right? And it wasn't Market Street, it was Shamokin. Like, it was very different back then, and things changed. So if you read a document from the 1700s about Shamokin, you have to read twice to realize, are they talking about Sunbury or actual Shamokin? I don't know, because it used to be different, right? So they knew this. The ancient people knew this, that if you want to tell somebody about what you're talking about, you just got to use the ancestors, because the ancestors never change. And if you can go back to where the ancestors were, you'll understand what they're talking about. How could they say, you know what I mean? A lot of the nations around, they couldn't write about Saudi Arabia here. They'd have to write about Dedan and Sheba, because that's where Dedan and Sheba were from, right? So it doesn't matter what it's called in the future. You can find it based on the ancestry, right? And that's why you run into problems when you read history and you get into all these old cities. A lot of times you got to look up, where were these? Unless you're in Europe. Europe still keeps a lot of them, but a lot of times the towns have changed so many times that it'll sound different, right? So that's why we're getting these really weird, strange names here. It all goes back to that Genesis 10. So we know that it's where Gomer, Magog, Tubal, Meshech of the past, when the nations were first born out of the Tower of Babel. So this is like the birth, the beginning of those nations, the first ancestors of these nations that we're going to be talking about here. So who are the enemies? It is Magog, first off, you can track to not only Russia, but Central Asia. It's Central Asia. Russia's directly above in the north, and this prophecy talks about the north, so it comes from the north. But it's really attached to the Scythians, all right? The Greek's word for them was called the Scythians. Josephus mentioned that the Magog, when they talked about Magog here, Josephus even said that these are the Scythians. The Magogians became the Scythians that the Greeks talked about. He wrote that in the Antiquities of the Jews. So did Jerome, and so did Herodotus, the father of history. From 484 to 425 BC, the father of history said that Magog is now the Scythians. And that's a guy that's not even religious per se, right? He's Greek. So the Magog was where the Scythians were. Now, who are the Scythians? They were a nomadic, barbaric people north of the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. And they were known for warrior culture, where they were mounted archers. They would ride horses and they'd shoot archery. And you can see that language in this prophecy. You'll see them all riding horses, because that's how the Scythians were. The Scythians back then dominated Ukraine, Russia, and what we'd call the other Stan countries, like Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, all those stands. It was a wide range, all the way from Ukraine over to basically until you ran into China. Some people actually even say there's a whole, I don't completely ascribe to it, there's a whole, the Great Wall of China is sometimes nicknamed the ramparts of Gog and Magog. And some people believe that it was set up to protect against this war. So you can look up the ramparts of Gog and Magog. Whether it was really called that for a reason, I don't know. But that's interesting to know. But that's where the Scythians dominated back then. So that's who this is referring to, this region, which is really interesting, because then once you look at like the Ukraine and Russian war, back the USSR, this looked a lot more probable. And then once the USSR broke up, it's like, oh, there goes all Magog getting chopped up, right? But now you see Ukraine being attacked and trying to get swallowed back up. That is all part of Magog of the past. And you can even see the Bible even referred to how barbaric these were. Paul knew how barbaric the Scythians were. Look what he says in Colossians 3:11. Here there is not Greek and Jew, circumcised and uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave, free, but Christ is all in all. Basically, Paul's saying it doesn't matter how barbaric you are. You could be a Scythian and the Lord could still save you. Do you see that language that he's using? He's referring to these people that were mounted warriors who were just barbaric, who just wiped people out. Right? And that's probably why, this is taking part in the Gog and Magog War. This is the setting. They come from this because these people have been barbaric tribes of the north. Now, who's the coalition? You got to start now looking at these other names. We saw Persia. Well, that one's easy, because Iran was Persia until the Islamic, Republic took over. So that's Persia. That one's pretty easy. When you look at Cush, Cush is where Sudan and Ethiopia, North Africa would be, which is an interesting one, because you don't think about Sudan and Ethiopia being involved in this. If you look at that, that's where Libya is at, which is really interesting. You can see on this map I have. So even they take part from Africa. And then you have Gomer and Beth Togarmah, which would be Turkey and parts of Eastern Europe, is where they would have been. So you can see it's an attack from all sides, except kind of like that southeast, which is really interesting. So it's basically saying currently Ukraine, Russia, all the stand countries that were in the USSR, Iran, Sudan, Ethiopia, Libya, and Turkey. And I mean, it's really interesting. All you have to do is look up Russia, Iran, and Turkey, and you'll see a picture of all their leaders together very recently, working together. All right, now we got to look at Gog, because remember, Gog is the leader. So who's this Gog that's going to be this leader? Some people get out of hand and they'll say, it's Vladimir Putin. I don't know if it's Vladimir Putin, guys, because Gog will come back in Revelation 20. Now, there's always a human concept to this, right? Humans have to fight the war, but I think Gog is a spiritual leader. Why? Well, first off, remember, Gog and Magog happens again in Revelation 20. How would Gog get wiped out in this war, get back up, and attack again in the millennial kingdom? I don't know. It would have to be a spiritual being, right? And if you remember in Numbers 24, this is when the prophecies by Balaam. Remember Balaam was Balak wanted him to prophesy against Israel, and Balaam gives this blessing, and his eyes are opened, he says, and he sees Jesus basically. Like, there's going to be this king, and he's going to be Lord over all. And remember, Balak got mad at him, wanted to fire him. He's like, you're supposed to curse them, you're blessing them. He says in his thing that the king shall be higher than Agag, which is also a translation of Gog here, and his kingdom shall be exalted. He's talking about the Lord Jesus that he saw back in Numbers 24. He's saying he'll be higher than Gog or Agag. Why would he say that? Unless it's some spiritually high chief prince. Remember, it's the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal. Remember when we did angelology and I was talking about the princes and the chief princes? So this is some high-ranking god. It's either Satan himself or some high, powerful spiritual being that leads this rebellion, when it shouldn't surprise us, because remember, Haman tried to wipe out the Jews just like Hitler did, right? And Haman's not Hitler, Hitler's not Haman, but there is some spirit behind him, similar to how I think Gog is behind all of this kind of stuff. So there's a spiritual aspect going on here. It's kind of like if you start to pick, try to guess who people are, it's just, don't worry about guessing the humans. It's a spiritual force that is going to run everything, which is why when you look at, people always try to guess who's the Antichrist, who's the Antichrist. There's always an Antichrist, I think, ready. I think Satan always has one that it could be ready at any time, but Satan doesn't know when he's going to need to use them. So don't worry about finding the human, because there will always be an Antichrist in the wings. There will always be a Gog in the wings. There will always be one ready, because Satan doesn't know when he's going to strike, but he needs one. That's why it's always a bunch of turmoil over in the Middle East and in these regions here. That's why when you turn on the news, it's going to talk about all these regions I'm talking about here is in the news. All you have to do is turn it on when you get home. So again, this is why Gog and Magog will happen again. Gog does not die. He's a spiritual being. It's either Satan or another god. And because Gog and Magog is just a pattern, right? Things are patterns. I talk about that all the time in here, but it's so important to understand this. The patterns are real, and the patterns happen because that's how the world works, and that's how the spiritual forces work. Satan will continually try to fight, right? He's going to try to fight through the Gog and Magog war. He's going to try to defeat God in Armageddon, and he's going to try to defeat God in the Gog and Magog war of Revelation 20 when he gets all the nations to rebel after he's released. And we shouldn't be surprised, because I think I just talked about it recently about the abomination of desolation. When Jesus is telling them about the abomination of desolation, Antiochus Epiphanes had already done it in 167 BC. Then it happened again by Titus Vespasian in 70 AD, but it's still going to happen again because these patterns keep happening, and Gog and Magog is just another pattern, which again is why this is a separate event from Revelation 20. So as you go on further into this, in verses 8 and 9 of Ezekiel and verses 13, first off, in 8 and 9, it talks about how the invasion occurs when Israel is dwelling securely, which is really interesting. How to make sense. That's where the details, people start to kind of talk about how does this make sense. Well, Israel could feel a false security due to the rapture, I believe. If this is directly after the rapture, imagine the chaos. Would there be time for war? Do you remember when COVID happened and like all the wars stopped in the world for a little bit because everybody was worried about this thing? I think there'll be a similar case here when the rapture happens. There'll be so much global chaos, they're going to have to put the wars and the nukes and stuff on pause for a second while everybody gets their bearings straight. And while everybody's getting their bearings straight, Gog and Magog and all these people find a perfect opportunity. They're opportunists. They strike when everybody's distracted of what's going on. Possibly that is a thought. The other thought is they feel like they're dwelling securely because they have the Iron Dome now. And they don't have to, they feel pretty secure with their military power and stuff. So could they have a false sense of security? Because when it says dwelling securely, the word used there is a false sense of security. So they're going to falsely feel secure. So whether that means, they're going to actually, people are going to let them go after the rapture, or they're going to feel like they're protected, I don't know. But they kind of get caught off guard. Israel's not actually going to be ready for this, which is good because God's going to intervene. But Sheba and Dedan and the merchants of Tarshish and all its leaders, you can see they don't join. They say, have you come to seize spoil? This war is going to be a lot about stealing what Israel has, whatever that may be, all their goods. It talks about livestock and all this produce, whatever it is. But you can see Sheba and Dedan, which you translate that, you follow that back, that's Saudi Arabia. Tarshish is either Spain or Great Britain, which is really interesting, and because it's based, goes back to tin, and that's what Britain's really known for, and so is Tarshish in the Bible. But either Spain or Britain and Saudi Arabia kind of question this, like, whoa, 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 what are you guys doing? So you can see right here, it's already different than Revelation 20, because they're not participating. They're kind of sitting on the sidelines, like, are you guys going to rob them? What are you guys doing? So it's interesting. And so you can see Jordan, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, even Lebanon's not involved, probably because they don't have any leadership right now. Hezbollah is getting destroyed, and that's always so crazy in Israel or in Lebanon. They only get supported from Iran. So they wouldn't even have the time to join in. But Jordan, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia don't participate, that's why people always talk about the Abraham Accords and how Jordan, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia kind of have good relationships with Israel right now. So this kind of stuff all lines up there as well. But it's interesting to think, like, why does Saudi Arabia not join, but Africa does? Well, if it's for plunder, Africa might have a need. They'll send some army up if they can get some plunder, right? They might need things where Saudi Arabia really has no need for this. Maybe Spain and Britain doesn't either, and they think it's just a terrible idea to get in a war over this kind of stuff. Then you see God's response in verses 19 and 20. God demonstrates his power through a massive earthquake, shaking the entire land, and then into 21 and 22. Let me scroll down here to where I'm at. All right, so verses 19 through 22 says, "For in my jealousy and in my blazing wrath I declare, on that day there shall be a great earthquake in the land of Israel." This one's really interesting. "The fish of the sea and the birds of the heavens and the beasts of the fields and all creeping things that creep on the ground and all the people who are on the face of the earth shall quake at my presence." Think about that. The birds, the fish are going to shake from this earthquake. It's global. It's a global earthquake. "And the mountains shall be thrown down, the cliffs shall fall, every wall shall tumble to the ground." And it continues on. Basically what this does, God causes confusion. There's infighting here, you'll see. He says, "I will summon a sword against Gog and all my mountains, declares the Lord. Every man's sword will be against his brother." So he's going to cause infighting, and he's going to have torrential rain, hailstones, fire, and he's going to win the war. It's going to be God versus these coalition. Israel's caught off guard. They're not ready for this. So God fights it. And that sounds bizarre. How is he going to cause infighting, and how's he going to do all this stuff? Well, again, these are patterns. Nothing should be new. If God's going to do this, he should have done it in the past, and he did. Remember, Joshua 10 is the biggest one. Joshua 10, it says that God killed more people than the army did in that one. What did he do? He sent hailstones. This is very similar to what he does there, and the sun stood still, if you remember. The Red Sea crossing, you ever think about that? He parts the Red Sea, but he also used it for a war. When they left, when they got through, he killed the Egyptians with the sea. We know that he sent the angel of the Lord. In Angelology, I talked about how the Assyrian army was destroyed. Israel didn't have to fight them. He killed 185,000 by himself. So the Lord's done it then. There's more. Jehoshaphat's victory in 2 Chronicles 20, guess what he did? He caused confusion among the attacking armies. What he just said he'll do in the Gog and Magog war. They're going to cause infighting just like he did in 2 Chronicles 20. The fall of Jericho's walls, that was God, right? And then the battle of Barak and Deborah. If you guys remember, Judges 4 and 5, when Deborah sends them into battle, God uses a rainstorm to flood the river Kishon. And in the song that you write in Genesis 5, 20 and 21, it talks about how God is the one to do this. He sent it so that they would be bogged down. Sisera's chariots got bogged down because of this rushing flood of water that came through. And the Lord is credited with winning that war as well. So this is nothing new. God's done it before. And you can't say God's done doing miracles because he did them in the Old Testament and he did them when Jesus is here. Now he doesn't do them anymore. That would be false because he continually does them. So these patterns are going to be done again here. And this whole thing is done to show his greatness. Remember, he wants to show his greatness to Israel. He wants to wake them up. And he also wants to let the nations know who he is. He says, "I will show my greatness and my holiness and make myself known in the eyes of many nations." That's why this event is happening. That's why he's bringing hooks into their drills to make this happen, right? He's forcing the issue so everybody can see that he is God and he is still in control of the universe. And then here is the total defeat. When you go to chapter 39, we'll finish up the prophecy here. In verses 3 through 5, God destroys the invading armies on the mountains of Israel, and their weapons are rendered useless. And then in verse 6, fire falls on the invaders and their homelands, which shows that God's judgment is global, right? It's not just on Israel. Their homelands get hit too. So what I put here, God essentially bombs them when they intend to bomb Israel. It's really interesting. This is the equivalent of God bombing a bunch of nations. It's going to rain fire down. That sounds like a bomb to me. And he's going to hit all of them that attacked Israel are going to get it from God. God will defeat all of these enemies here of Israel. Now here's where it gets really interesting. Let's read verses 9 through 16 here of Ezekiel 39. Verse 9. Then those who dwell in the cities of Israel will go out and make fires of the weapons and burn them. Shields and bucklers, bows and arrows, clubs and spears. Look at this. They will make fires of them for 7 years, so that they will not need to take wood out of the field or cut down any of the forest, for they will make their fires of the weapons. They will seize the spoil, those who despoiled them, and plunder those who plundered them, declares the Lord. On that day, I will give to Gog a place for burial in Israel, the valley of the travelers, east of the sea. It will block the travelers, for there Gog and all his multitude will be buried. It will be called the valley of Haman Hagag. Look at this. For 7 months, the house of Israel will be burying them in order to cleanse the land. All the people of the land will bury them, and it will bring them renown on that day that I show my glory, declares the Lord God. Here's another weird verse, 14. Read this one. They will set apart men to travel through the land regularly and bury those travelers remaining on the face of the land so as to cleanse it. At the end of the 7 months, they will make it their search. Here it is. And when these travel through the land and anyone sees a human bone, then he shall set up a sign by it. To the buriers have buried it in the valley of Haman Gog. Isn't that weird? They're going to burn the weapons for 7 years. They don't need wood anymore, which, by the way, doesn't that fit perfectly the 7-year tribulation? Right after this happens, they'll be burning for the whole tribulation. They won't ever need to get wood, and they'll have all the energy they would need. All the energy. That's interesting, right? And the dead are buried for 7 months. That's a lot of bodies. Haman Gog just means the multitude. It means a mass grave. Mass grave. The reason this is really interesting is because it sounds a lot like nuclear warfare to me. Weapons burning. What weapons could burn for 7 years? If you look into the nuclear weapons and all the energy they have, nuclear weapons could. If you could harness nuclear energy, you could have it burn. You wouldn't need fuel or wood at all, right? The other thing that's really interesting, and this is all conjecture, maybe it's not, but why would there be this weird cleanup? The detailed burial process mirrors modern procedures for handling contaminated remains. It says if you walk by and you see a dead body, don't touch it. Put a sign by it and keep going, because we have specialists that'll come through the land and they'll clean it up and they'll take it to the burial ground where this mass grave is, where you wouldn't want a bunch of radioactive bodies all over the place. You'd want them in one spot and away, right? But it's really interesting. There's a mass burial too. So this seems to be nuclear war implications, which I think is very possible, especially in today's time. That's conjecture. It's just an interesting thought there. But the spiritual impact on Israel, Israel recognizes the Lord as their God. They recognize, the Lord is here with them. They have their eyes open. And there are people in Israel now that believe in God. There's a lot that are just kind of atheists or agnostics. That's going to change in Israel. They're all going to believe in God. They're not going to believe in Christ yet, but this is going to start that process to awaken them, right? And look what it says. I will not hide my face anymore from them when I pour out my spirit upon the house of Israel. So remember, he was keeping them blind. He's not going to hide his face. He's saying, I'm hiding my face right now from Israel. That's why they're spiritually blind. But I will pour out my spirit, just like I told Ezekiel I would in the valley of dry bones. I've got them restored physically, then I'm going to restore them spiritually. And here are the global implications. Think about this. The rapture sets the scene for Gog and Magog, I believe. This would remove all the Christians. So Christians can't get in the way of the Antichrist anymore. Not only that, all those nations that just got wiped out in Gog and Magog, predominantly Muslim. A lot of the Muslim power right there. So after this, you got Christianity gone from the rapture. You got Muslims that just got crushed in a war. The only Abrahamic religion left with everybody left is the Jews, which would make sense. They're in Israel, and that's what this whole thing's about, is waking Israel back up, right? So the Antichrist will be able to waltz right in, have no Muslims or Christians saying, no, they're wrong. And he'll start to work with the Jews. There'll be no other Abrahamic religions that will really have a foothold. And he'll say, let's make a new religion. I'll work with you guys. We can build your temple back up, and we'll make it happen. And there will be no other Abrahamic religions to get in the way, if I'm right, and if this is true, based on how it all shakes out. And the final one, I just want to go again to the final Magog War. We won't have a lot of time to go into it because we'll get to this when we get there. But you can see how this one's very different. And when the 1,000 years are ended, right, Satan will be released from his prison, will come out to deceive the nations that are at the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, and gather them for battle. Their number is like the sand of the sea, and they marched up over the broad plain of the earth, surrounded the camp of the saints, but fire came down from heaven and consumed them. The difference is when the 1,000 years are ended, how would they burn weapons? How would they burn weapons for 7 years in the millennial kingdom? That sounds really bizarre. Doesn't make sense, but it fits the 7-year tribulation perfectly, right? That's why I think these are definitely two separate events. This is a global rebellion with Satan where he'll be defeated completely at the end. That's what happens there. So the main points of this, the whole event shows that God is sovereign and he wants it to be made known. That's why this event happens. That's why he puts hook in their jaws and brings them forth. This is also to begin Israel's restoration. It begins the spiritual awakening process. It will not be complete until halfway through the tribulation. I'll talk about that next time. And this is also assurance for believers like us, that no matter how chaotic it looks, don't worry about the nukes and all the things around the world. God is in control. However, people are going to die in these wars. They've been since the beginning of time. But in the end, they will not win. God will defeat them. And he doesn't need a human army to do it. He doesn't need the Iron Dome to stop anything. So think about that. That's what this is. We know this prophecy. We're not going to be involved in it, I don't think. But it's to know that God will defeat all this evil that we see going on in the world. With that said, does anybody have any questions or comments based on the Gog and Magog Wars? Beard.
So how does Israel and the full promised land fall into? Like, when does Israel get all their land at some point?
Oh, it's a great question. Does Israel get all their land? Only when the Lord comes back. So even in the tribulation, as we get to that, I don't think they'll have complete full control yet, because it'll still be in the times of the Gentiles. And the times of the Gentiles is when Jerusalem is not fully, completely in control of the Jews. And I believe the Antichrist will still have full control of Jerusalem, although they'll be able to worship in the temple. They will not have control. And until they get control of Jerusalem, they're not going to have control of the rest of their land. And by the way, if you do look at it, what Beard might be getting at, if you look at it, Israel still never had all of the land that Abraham was promised. That's why they have to come back, or God's a liar. And I guarantee you, God is not a liar. So Beard's asking, when do they get this all back now? I don't think they ever get it back until the Lord returns. He's the only one possible to get them all their land back in this political climate. Benjamin Netanyahu is never going to get close to getting it back, especially if he might go to jail first with all that chaos going on. But nobody's able to get Israel's land back except for Christ himself. And I think that's when it'll happen at the millennial kingdom is when that will happen. But the interesting part is it would probably be before that final one, though, because the Lord will be back before this final one. So they'll have the land here. They wouldn't have it at the first Gog and Magog, and they won't get it back soon after. Great question, Beard. Anybody else have any thoughts or questions on any of that? All right. Well, that said, next week I'm not going to be here. Matt Shavi is going to fill in. But then after that, we'll be back for the tribulation and the Antichrist. Of course, it's going to get really interesting. And then the final one after that is the second coming, millennium, and eternal state. So thank you, everybody. Have a blessed rest of your day, and I'll see you again soon.